So Kathy, can I get your name, the spelling, and then your title?
My name is Kathy Kelly, last name Kelly, first name spelled with a K, and I'm a co-coordinator of Voices for Creative Nonviolence.
They haven't left yet, have they? Thank you so much for doing this. I appreciate you taking time out of your schedule.
Oh, sure.
And so we'll try to make this easy, and you know, I want to make it worthwhile to you too. So if there's things I don't ask but you think are important that get said, you know, I'll try to remember to ask you to fill in those holes as well. So.
Okay.
Anyway, and just so I can maybe make a program or something, a short thing that benefits you, can you just tell me about Voices in the Wilderness? So
Voices in the Wilderness was a campaign to end the economic sanctions against Iraq, begun in 1996. A group of people had come together in late 1995 and realized that even though most people had forgotten about Iraq in the United States, the war that began in 1991 had never really ended. A number of us had been there before or during or just after that war. And the war that was a bombing war that destroyed much of Iraq's infrastructure then changed into an economic warfare. And it existed in the form of economic sanctions. Maybe one of the best kept secrets in the United States was that those sanctions directly contributed toward the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. So we decided as a nonviolent campaign that we would bring medicines over to Iraq without seeking permission. In fact, we broke the U.S. law by breaking the economic sanctions. And we organized 70 delegations to go to Iraq. At one point, Bishop Thomas Gumbleton called us and said, "I'd like to go with one of your delegations." And we were thrilled. We really felt as though his approval would have been enough, but that he would travel with the group meant a very great deal to us. When it seemed likely that another military bombardment was coming, again Bishop Gumbleton went over to Iraq, and our group stayed and remained in Iraq throughout the shock and awe bombing, and in the days of the beginning months of the occupation, again Bishop Gumbleton went over to be with Iraqis in that terrible trauma when there was no plan in place, and so much was falling apart and becoming increasingly violent in Iraq. We were found guilty by a United States judge. He ruled that those who break an unjust law should do so openly, lovingly, and with a readiness to pay the penalty. And we said, "Oh, if you want to put us in jail, we'll go openly and lovingly. We've done that before, but we won't pay any money to the government that continues to wage warfare against people who have committed no crime." And also a new form of economic warfare is actually going on, we believe, against Iraq. So we're now called Voices for Creative Nonviolence. We've continued with our work. The sanctions have ended, not because we managed to lift them, but we still feel a deep responsibility to people who've been so hospitable toward us and who long so much to see an end to war.
well, how many times have you been to Iraq with Tom?
I personally have gone to Iraq 26 times and was privileged to travel with Tom Gumbleton on 2 different trips. I think that he has probably gone over at least 9 or 10 times.
Well, you know, what is it about Iraq and Bosnia and Haiti that brings you and Tom, or that attracts you and Tom? I mean, you could be doing so many other things, other equally important, but you know, what is it that brings you there, that you and Tom might have in common?
I suppose a lot of people might wonder, why would a bishop with all the responsibilities for confirmations and baptisms and different celebrations locally be peeling off to go to war zones, places like Haiti and Bosnia and Iraq and Colombia? And I think that we sometimes at this distance can lose touch with the original understanding in church history, Christian church history, that a bishop was designated as a symbol of unity with the wider church, and perhaps in our comfort that so many of us dwell in, not necessarily Tom Gumbleton, believe me, but in the comfort that many of us in the United States enjoy, how do we experience unification, a point of union with people who are suffering desperately from malnourishment, who can't feed their children, with people who can't get clean water, with people who are huddling under bombardment and are frightened that they won't make it through the night, with people whose everyday experiences have to do with death squads and massacres and assassinations. Well, one way to have that unifying bond is for the bishops to say, we'll go, send us, this is our responsibility, this is our duty. We really believe that we are all part of one another, that the Eucharist brings us all together, so we'll celebrate that Eucharist in common with people in other lands, and if not, in fact, celebrating the traditional liturgy. Liturgy kind of means the work of the people. Our work will be to try to bind us more and more together, especially so that we learn better how to share our resources, how to live more simply, and how to advocate for nonviolent ways to resolve problems, because we believe in love of enemy and love of neighbor and the mandate never ever to kill or store up weapons to kill or pay for weapons to kill. So I see Bishop Gumbleton setting the example that's so vitally, crucially needed. Every day that passes, it's needed more because the weapon proliferation spirals out of control and because communities become more and more desperate, while it could be seen that the United States is kind of almost in the role of a rogue superpower, demanding that other people subordinate themselves to our national interests as though we're somehow entitled to get more because we already have so much. You won't find Bishop Tom Gumbleton trying to adjust the gospel of Jesus to accommodate that idea. He just won't have anything to do with it, and he lives a life that shows no interest in accumulating personal wealth. Well, what are we who see him doing that relentlessly, giving us an example, a role model? What are we to do if not try, humbly of necessity, to pattern ourselves in some way as disciples of what he's trying to create? It's probably clear that many of the hierarchy within the Catholic Church won't avail themselves of that example. But that shouldn't deter any of us from saying, well, that's all right. You know, everybody finds their own way to make peace with their God and their beliefs. But those of us who were taught a belief system that said love your neighbor and care for those in need, I think many find Tom Gumbleton irresistible and want to try to do what they can to be part of what he does.
You've hit it right on the head. You know, I feel like I can't really do exactly what Tom does, but I figure maybe by doing this, I can help him in some way. That's how. Rita Mary might have the answer to this, but I kind of want you to help me with it. How many Catholic bishops are there in the United States, approximately? Or I remember reading somewhere that there
310 or 410.
I think it's 410.
But then, how many opposed the war actually, or actually spoke out? I know Tom, there's like only 5 or 6 or something, right? Or wasn't it?
I thought the vote was like 3 to everything else that day. But I think the bishops have made a statement. But he says they've issued a statement, but they don't preach, and the pastors, it's not being preached at the local level.
Yeah, if there's some way you could work that in, that, you know, out of how many bishops, you know, Tom, you know, is the one, you know, kind of going against the grain to, you know, and really doing what Jesus really intended versus, is there a way to work that in?
A bishop is, of course, supposed to be a symbol of unity with Rome as well, and in the Vatican there were pronouncements again and again and again condemning the economic sanctions. Every New Year's speech that Pope John Paul II gave always said that the economic sanctions should be ended, and then as it looked more and more likely that the United States would go to war, there was a condemnation that came out of the war, begging the world not to go to war. This came from the Vatican, and the U.S. bishops did respond with a document. I think there was a timidity on the part of the United States bishops about appearing to go up against the strongest political lobby on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and that is the defense lobby. Why would there be such a reticence? Well, I think it's fair to acknowledge that there has been in some areas of the Catholic Church in the United States a financial meltdown, if you will, over the issue of lawsuits being raised and archdioceses being embroiled in the courts and sometimes having to pay huge amounts of money in settlements for cases mainly related to pedophilia. And I suppose that some bishops thought, well, we've taken one hit financially. How are we to survive if we alienate people who have great amounts of money, who are involved in corporate defense establishment America. Now, when you look at how much U.S. wealth and productivity is tied up in corporate defense establishment, it's huge. I mean, just to name some of the companies, they're companies that have bases in major cities and archdioceses all around the United States. Westinghouse, General Electric, General Motors, Lockheed, Raytheon, Alliant Tech. If you think about some of the major Catholic universities, they all have research programs linked up to the Defense Department, and I almost can't think of any that don't have an ROTC program on their campus, so they're militarized as well. It's a difficult thing, I know, for anyone to say, well, I'm going to climb out on that limb, and I've got my saw, and I'm sawing the limb off behind me, and I might come crashing down. But what is so remarkable about Bishop Tom Gumbleton is he will never let convenience interfere with his own deepest beliefs. He simply goes right out on that limb and takes the risks. And, then you start to remember, well, yeah, Jesus didn't die of old age. 11 of the 12 apostles were imprisoned. The reason that in Mark's gospel you hear the phrase over and over again, don't be afraid, is because anybody following Jesus had enormous reason to be afraid, and they were all flying in the face of cultural norms of their time. But you wouldn't find a shrill note sounded by Bishop Tom Gumbleton. He is emphatic. His words are often much more radical than anything else that I'll be hearing, but rooted in a very loving and caring and deeply faith-based perspective.
This is more of a broad, there's trying to make multiple programs out of this. A lot of your comments work for it. So why are the issues of peace and justice important today? I mean, a lot of people, it just seems to be buzzwords. They don't seem to, it doesn't connect, and I especially business people, it's not even on their radar, and it's to me, it's amazing. So why what would you say to people? Why is peace and justice, work for peace and justice important?
The qualities of peace and justice work might almost seem cliche to the extent that people might think, oh, isn't that a course that you take when you're in high school somewhere? But in fact, it seems to me that a way to get a grip on just how important more equitable and peaceable solutions might be would be to just think about the word looters. In the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, I know people thought, people are running hog wild in the streets and looting is going on. And certainly when I was in Baghdad, after the United States troops arrived and when the Iraqi government had disappeared, and when it became clear that there was no one with any kind of authority to stop anyone, the looting was massive in many different places. And, who wouldn't think, well, that's very, very, very unfortunate and wrongful or even criminal. What we aren't thinking about is... What we aren't thinking about is that in a world where there are irreplaceable fossil fuels, they're not going to regenerate themselves, the fossil fuels that give us so much of the energy that we consume, I want to say recklessly. We're taking from the finite amount that's available for children in our planet today and their offspring. And in a sense, when we keep on consuming like there's no tomorrow, when we don't have elected representatives that pay attention to energy plans, alternative energy plans, finding solar energy, finding new means like wind energy, finding ways to put the scientists' attention and skill to the problem solving that's needed rather than letting them develop more and more easily saleable and smuggleable weapons of mass destruction. Well, we're looting from the inheritance, from the potential future of future generations, even of the present generation of children. And yet I don't hear disapproval anywhere near commensurate to what I'd hear if somebody broke a window and stole something inside of a store downtown in Chicago. So peace and justice is not a sugary, sweet thing that you want to study before you go to your confirmation class. I think that the vital issues of our time have everything to do with figuring out how to live in harmony with the planet. And we've done miserably. We've wrecked the water systems in many places. We've polluted and contaminated the air, polluted the ground. And just that should perhaps signal a sense of, I don't want to encourage terror, but a great fear. And with the great war on terror being waged, it again turns people away from the major issues. And anyway, even in that readiness to use threat and force as the basis for our foreign policy, we aren't asking ourselves, why would people be so angry with the United States or with Western powers that they would consider waging the kind of war that they can wage? Some have said that the warfare is the terrorism of the rich, and terrorism is the war of the poor.
It seems to me, it's a generational thing. For Tom, it might have been Vatican II. For you, it might have been the '60s, peace and justice, and the whole war. I'm trying to figure out what is going to motivate the next generation of people, of children. I've got a daughter who's 11 and a son who's 8, and frankly, I don't know how to make this, to make them aware of these things properly, at their age, and then that whole age group from them up to I'm 42. So how do you, who's taking over your place? Who's going to take over for Tom and you and for everybody? Who do you see doing the work?
When I ask myself, what will rise people and what will raise up a new generation of teachers and students who might be feeling that they've got the skills and the abilities to tackle these tremendous problems of injustice and war making, I place a lot of hope and surprise, to be honest, because there's nothing I can easily predict. But having myself grown up in the 50s and then having seen as a young teenager the beginnings of reforms that came about in the 60s, I can certainly say there was nothing in the decade of the 50s that would have indicated that the 60s was going to come around the corner and be a fairly creative time of change. Now, I think a lot of people think, 60s, well, those were hippies, and we're not going to be hippies. But I think people are a bit hard on that generation that accomplished the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, and a belief on the parts of many people that you could, in fact, live your life in a different way than your parents' generation had, and do so in a continuation of loving relationship, that there didn't have to be a kind of lockstep, do it this way and believe this way because that's the way that your family and your parents believed. In fact, I think there was a real freeing that happened. Now, we have to accept that in the eyes of many young people, the hippies were a contemptible group of dropouts and a horrible example, and you'd never want to ever be labeled hippie. So maybe something else is going to come around the corner. I'm not quite sure what it would be. I do have a great hope that young people who are aware of Tom Gumbleton would realize that they've got such a gem in their midst and try to learn from him. The other thing that I sometimes think about is that no one knew that Mikhail Gorbachev would come into power and initiate the Perestroika movement, which changed world history in many ways. No one could have predicted in another part of the world, in El Salvador, that Archbishop Romero, who was a conservative, an arch-conservative nearly, would at some point be so converted by Jesuit priests who had been murdered and by the poor of El Salvador that he would become a beacon to the entire Central and South American world of parishes and Catholic teachings, and I think that his strength will continue. Likewise, you couldn't, argue that there won't be some person who's kind of unexpected. I mean, who'd have thought Cindy Sheehan in a drainage ditch would make the impact that she made? People didn't exactly bet their money on Michael Moore having a big impact. And we can go on along that line. If Pope John the 23rd wasn't expected to make great changes, and Vatican II was an enormous change within the Catholic Church. So we certainly have reason, I think, to persist with optimism. Or, as Edward Galeano, a philosopher from Uruguay, said when he recorded a line written on by a graffiti artist on a wall that he'd passed, let's save our pessimism for better times. Speak at a large gathering, and I thought, no, I better not tell him I just planted corn on a nuclear missile silo and I'm going to jail. That might be too much for this fellow. Little did I know, he probably would have been right out behind us giving us a lift.
He'd give you the water for it.
Yeah, right.
Well, just in general, then, just to kind of round out the thing on Tom, just in general, what are your thoughts on Tom Gumbleton or Bishop Tom? When you think of Tom, what do you think of?
If I'm having a down moment or a time when I know I need to think of someone or something that would kind of make my lips rise a bit in a smile, Tom Gumbleton does it for me every time. If I think about Tom Gumbleton, I feel a certain sense of happy contentment. I just have only to remember a day when I saw him and I was afraid that maybe something had gotten back to him about me that might have offended him, and I was trying to present to him another, and he just turned to me and he said, "You don't have to worry about what I think of you. I think you're great." There was just this complete affirmation, and I felt as though I was on a magic carpet ride. I'm sure that there are so many people who, in many situations of much deeper antagonism or troubled spirits or destitution or fear, have in the most personable of ways felt that sense of comfort and assurance coming from Tom Gumbleton. He radiates goodwill and the energy to try to make a difference. I also am so grateful to him for the schedule that he's kept. It's very demanding. He bounds all over the planet, and yet if you see him on an airplane, and I've several times noted this, out comes the New York Review of Books or a very challenging tome that he's in the middle of studying, and he uses that time very, very well. And you just kind of know that he realizes time is precious, and he doesn't want to squander any of the potential that he has to really keep on top of political events, current events, cultural events. He's one of the most erudite, well-read, and thoughtful people I've ever met. And again, that sets a standard and it sets a challenge, and many, many, many people have felt it. And so it's kind of like having a good sports coach in your midst. Nobody wants to let down the team when you're around Tom Gumbleton, and the team is very far and very wide and very extended. Also, I've had the experience that people from a completely different culture in Iraq, whether they were very, very poor people, Christian people, Muslim people, people coming from government perspectives, they warmed up to him so quickly. And then if I was the next one over there, people would be asking, well, what about Tom? Is he coming back?
As far as Tom, he's got kind of like two sides. I think people who don't know him think, oh, he's just out there to make headlines for himself. He's just out here to, make a name for himself. But really, Tom isn't like that at all. He seems, to prefer almost the quiet and solitude. Yet he puts himself out there. Have you noticed that, or how, in the times you spent with Tom, what's he like when you're with him?
One thing that I notice about Tom Gumbleton is that he's very understated in his approach when he's not in front of a microphone or at a podium or delivering a homily. He's thoughtful. He listens a great deal. Sometimes he has to struggle to pick things up. He would never strike anyone as a character who over asserts himself in any kind of a group setting. In fact, you might not know that he's there. He loves to just kind of slip in and mingle and be part of a group process, but not to be the one who takes over or in any way shows off. It's like a a non sequitur to think of Tom Gumbleton trying to impress people. It just wouldn't fit at all amongst those who've known him, worked with him, traveled with him. But if there is a need to speak truth to power, forgive the cliche, he'll do it. And he'll do it in a way that takes a risk, and he'll speak very emphatically, particularly when he's speaking from the scriptures. He's quite faithful to that Old and New Testament message that's quite fiery in pronouncement. He doesn't pull his punches, if you will. He speaks directly and clearly.
If in a short encapsulation of Tom, and why is the work that he and you and many others are doing, why is it important?
Many have, I think, understood the church as ecclesia, gathering of the people, but there are so many people who get left out of the gathering, who don't even get close to the table. And because Tom is willing to say, everybody in, nobody out, he is vital and crucial and so needed.
Okay, now, because, if I Google something, or, I want something like this to appear, and it's so easy nowadays to post these little video clips.
Yeah. I would like to say something about risk-taking. I think especially in the aftermath of September 11th, people in the United States became more fearful about speaking up, about claiming their right to assemble peaceably for redress of grievance, because maybe there might be people taking notes, or maybe there might be people that would break up the assembly, and people are frightened about possibly going before the courts. And I find that people like Bishop Tom Gumbleton, who didn't miss a step, who didn't miss a beat in this time of change and flux, and remained as strong and vigorous as they had been, are particularly important. And I think it's good not to lose sight of the idea that although there might be risks in speaking up against war making, against reckless decision making that happens in our country with regard to war, there may be risks. I don't think that the risks are anything close to the risks that are experienced by people who bear the brunt of our foreign policy. When the United States supports a dictator in another country, then people who risk speaking up and defying, opposing that dictator, are risking massacres, disappearances, assassinations, tortures, their own family members being punished for what they did. But if some of us go and read out the names of people who've been killed in Iraq, both Iraqi and U.S. soldiers, we don't face any of those kinds of risks. We don't face a risk anywhere near as great as what a military person in the United States would face if they were to defy the orders to go and continue the killing or the bloodshed in another area. So I think it's a good idea for us not to get swept away by the sense of, oh, that's too risky. You will be punished by the U.S. government if you speak up. I think people should ask themselves, do I want warfare in my personal budget? Do I want to pay for it? I don't think there are very many people who can take paying for war out of their personal budget. I realize that, but I still think it's good to ask the question. And I think people should ask, what does the United States government want from us in order to perpetuate this ongoing war on terror? And I think, by and large, what's wanted is not our bodies for many of us. Our assent isn't even necessarily required. What they want is our money. And I think we should ask, to what extent are we willing to collaborate with a government that increasingly brings together corporate America with war making and killing and maiming and all of the consequences of going to war? That's where I think a lot of the peace and justice work can begin. At the same time, I also think it's good to remember the feminists in the 60s who said the only stars are in the firmament, and that the most important circle that we need to swell and expand is the circle of people who are doing some very humble, ordinary tasks. We can take a cue from Bishop Gumbleton, who's one of the most humble people I know. The humble tasks of renting the hall for the talk and putting out the press release and activating the phone tree and making the banners. This is the work of peace so crucial.
That's
Perfect timing. The circle that's so important to expand is the circle of people who are doing the humble work. I mean, that's why Bishop Gumbleton is also such a good example. The work of making the reservations for halls and writing the press release and activating the phone tree and doing all of the very simple tasks that are involved in order to further the education and build the ranks of those who are dedicated to peace. All right.